Thank you so much, Anonymous Voice, and thank you all so much for sticking around through lunch. I am absolutely thrilled to be able to introduce our afternoon keynote and our next speaker, Jason Feifer. Jason Feifer does a lot of things. He's the editor-in-chief of Entrepreneur Magazine. He's the host of numerous podcasts, including Pessimist's Archive. Gene this morning started talking about the sort of lessons from history and looking to the past as we consider the future of speech online. And I think what Jason's podcast and talk really focuses on is exactly picking up on that theme. That what we're going through right now, grappling with new technology, how does it change society? What does it mean for my ability to speak, for our ability to communicate with one another, are not new. And that there are lessons from things that we take for granted. Comic books, chain stores, the telegraph, the waltz, the umbrella, coffee, right? Like stuff that I'm sure many of us enjoy in our day-to-day lives. At their time were revolutionary. And what I love about Pessimist's Archive is it's that history, the history of why we resist new things and how they come to be commonplace. And I think that's just a perfect fit and a natural complement to so many of the discussions we're having today. So while I am at the microphone, I will encourage all of you to go on Twitter and follow @Pessimist'sArc and go onto your podcast app of choice and subscribe to the podcast. And welcome to the stage, Jason Feifer.
Thank you everyone. Thank you, Jesse, for that lovely and wonderfully promotional introduction. I really appreciate it. Right, of course, today is a day talking about speech and about technology, which really means that it's talking about change, because change is, of course, at the very heart of this, and change is very scary and very difficult. And so what I'd love to do today is talk you through some of the lessons that I have learned in studying change, in studying how people have resisted and then eventually come to embrace new technologies. And to start, I'd like to take you to the bicycle. So when the bicycle was introduced, it, like just about everything else, when it is new, freaked people out. And people were very concerned for all sorts of reasons. For example, people were concerned that the wheel spinning constantly was something that we were not physically able to manage in our brains, and thus it would make us homicidal. We were also concerned, is anybody a sufferer of, don't be afraid, of bicycle face? Any suffer? So this was an actual medical condition believed at the time in which wind would be blowing in our faces while we were riding the bicycle so much that it would permanently stretch out our faces and we would have bicycle face. But the thing that I love most in the research that I had done about the bicycle was this one article from 1896 talking to business owners about their concerns about the bicycle, because there were many of them. So for example, the bar owners were concerned that people weren't coming into the bars in the middle of the day anymore to drink beer, because now they were drinking water because they were riding the bicycle. They were also concerned, the cobblers were concerned because the people weren't buying as many heavy shoes because they were buying lighter shoes because they were riding the bicycle. And my favorite is the fancy felt hat guy. The fancy felt hat guy who was very, very concerned that people weren't buying as many fancy felt hats because they were buying these lighter caps because they were riding the bicycle. And so he told a reporter at the time that he believed, and here it is, let's look at it. One irate member of the trade proposes that Congress be asked to pass a law compelling each bicycle rider to purchase at least 2 felt hats a year to compensate him for the loss of sales. Now, we laugh at this, as we should, and yet I propose to you all that we have done some version of this ourselves, right? Where we were good at something, we knew something, we were comfortable with something, and then change came along and we said, no! No, I'm saying right here, you change. I'm not changing. I already know this thing. I'm very comfortable with this thing. And that is natural, but it is also wrong. Because, for example, with this fancy felt hat guy, had this guy said, you know what? I don't make fancy felt hats. I make hats. I make hats, and I will make hats for anybody who wants a hat. I don't care if you're riding a bicycle. If you do, then I will make a hat for you. Whatever it is, I want hats. That guy would have made a killing because, as it turns out, the hat and cap industry is twice the size of the bicycle industry. There was a killing to be made. But this is what we do. This is so natural. When we're talking about people embracing change, we are going up literally against the thing that we are born with, which is a resistance to change. For example, this is my child. He is Fen. He's 4 years old, and this is the day that we got him new shoes. He was very upset about it. He kept saying that he wanted his old shoes. I want my old shoes. I want my old shoes. And we were trying to say, Fen, when your old shoes were new shoes, you hated them too. But he can't understand that. But we force him to wear the new shoes, and a couple days later, look, he's thrilled. He likes the new shoes. So what I want to do now is break down 3 ways that I have seen, 3 patterns that I have seen in resistance to change. And then 3 ways in which I think that we can get people closer to embracing that change. So here's number 1. We are losing something fundamental. This is a great fear. You see it throughout history. We're losing something fundamental. Here's an example. So this is an illustration that ran with an essay written by John Philip Sousa at the dawn of recorded music. Now, John Philip Sousa, perhaps you know his name. He's written every march you know. Da, 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 da. That's John Philip Sousa. John Philip Sousa was very, very opposed to recorded music. Well, he was a live music guy. And so he argued he had many arguments, but this is my favorite. This representation is my favorite. Here it is. He's arguing that, follow me here, recorded music will replace all forms of live music. And live music, by the way, in case you don't know, is a phrase that actually came out of the musicians' unions when they were trying to campaign against recorded music technology. They were trying to contrast dead or canned music with live music. That's where we get that phrase from. So he's saying that recorded music will replace all forms of live music, which means that if you bring recorded music technology into the home, well then, it will stop mothers from singing to their children. Why would they do that? They would instead just put the recorded music technology in front of the children. And because children grow up imitating their mothers, that means naturally that we will raise a generation of machine babies. And, you know, that's not correct. But you can see how people are afraid. That they're afraid that when you introduce something new, that it replaces everything, every form of it. But that's, of course, not what happens. I mean, what John Philip Sousa is saying is really no different from the movie theater industry being afraid that VCRs were going to shut them down. The thing is that we don't replace everything; we integrate. New things don't replace all the time; they integrate, and we don't naturally understand that. Here's number 2. We're creating an imbalance from which we cannot recover. I'm going to break this into 2. The first one is protectionism. We've all seen that. Here's one of my favorite examples. So these are some women who are campaigning against laws that have made margarine far too expensive because of taxes, but also 30 states enjoy margarine but don't enjoy paying taxes. Do you know what some of the other states enjoyed? Pink and black margarine, because the butter industry had done such a good job of passing laws to make margarine seem unappealing. And well, what's happening here? I mean, I go back to this thing that I said, we're creating an imbalance from which we cannot recover, because I think that these incumbents are feeling like they've earned this, they've owned this, and now something has come along, and they don't believe that they can compete in an open marketplace. So we've created an imbalance from which we cannot recover. There's also, of course, the cultural version of this. So here's novel reading, A Cause of Female Depravity, in which, in this case, somebody is describing parents being driven to a premature grave because their daughters are reading novels. Again, what is really happening here? I'll tell you, the way that I see it is that people are seeing a change, and they're not understanding that we can adapt to that change. They're not seeing that we aren't as simple as the thing that we're looking at. I have this theory. It's called that people confuse the shape with the thing. The thing is something fundamental about us. Maybe it's intellectual exercise. Maybe it's conversation or community. And then the shape is just the way in which it is expressed in any one generation. So it's WhatsApp groups or it's bowling leagues. And one generation comes up and sees a community is bowling leagues, and then the bowling league goes away and it's replaced by something else, and they say, oh no, we've lost community. You haven't lost community. You just lost the shape that you were familiar with of community. It's an important distinction, but we confuse the two, and we think that we're losing something fundamental when something changes, even though we're not. Number 3, this change is unnatural. Kind of very similar in a way to what I was talking about, but I want to draw a distinction here. So I love this. This is just a nice collection right in one article of all the diseases following in the train of progressing civilization. So we've got all sorts of things: railroad kidney, telephone tinnitus. These are real things that people were very concerned about at the time. There was neurasthenia was a turn of the century condition, people believed. It basically meant that life was so busy that you had a disease, that your brain was breaking down. This should sound familiar. This is basically what we talk about now when we talk about addictive technology. The technology is too addictive. Our brains are not built to handle it. We've created something unnatural. Now, those are 3 patterns that I've seen, and before I move on to solutions, I want to pose a kind of philosophical question, which is, why does this matter? Why does it matter? Why does it matter that people are upset, afraid? Also, possibly, maybe they were right. They saw some change. They didn't not see change. So what is important here? Why are we talking about this? Why should we care about this? Let me answer that by first introducing you to the automobile brain! The automobile brain! So in the dawn of the automobile, scientists were very concerned that the car was literally changing the shape of people's brains. Literally changing. Look at that. That is an actual illustration that ran in the New York Times in, I think, 1902. And of course, you see, the brain specialist predicted that motor maniacs will be represented in the insane asylum in the near future, changing our brains. And here's the thing. That guy was right, in a way. He was right about something. What he was right about was that the car does change our brains. I mean, I called a neuroscientist recently, and I asked him, if you scanned the brain of somebody before they learned how to drive the car today, and then scanned them after they learned how to drive the car, would the brain change? Would you see a change? The answer is yes. I mean, you know what? You could see a change before all of your brains, before you walked in today and afterwards. Because the thing is that the brain is supposed to change. It's literally supposed, it is built to change. That is what we are supposed to do. But what happens is that we see change, and we don't recognize it as part of a pattern. We don't see that change is the constant. We think that change is a singular incident, and then that thus must mean that we have done something terrible to ourselves. But change is the constant. So if we only recognize change as being something that is disruptive and not something that is part of a natural progression, well, what do? Well, we do 2 things, as I see it. One, we miss opportunities, important opportunities. And then number 2, we propose the wrong solutions. So here's what I mean. For example, here's the classic Atlantic cover: is Google stupid? Is Google making us stupid? So right, what the net seems to be doing is chipping away at my capacity for concentration and contemplation. That's what the writer in the Atlantic. And then just just for contrast, because that was not a new observation, 1922. It is the day of the fleeting vision. Concentration, thoroughness, the quieter reflection that ripens a judgment are more difficult than ever. What has happened? I think that people, you see how we're responding to having something like Google in our lives, and we say, oh, well, you know what? People aren't maybe memorizing information as much. They're not thinking the way that they used to. They're not approaching information in the same way as before. Because for a long time, retention of information was a very valuable skill. And now, maybe it's not. Maybe it's not. Maybe that's fine. What if instead pattern recognition today is a really important skill? Finding information, pulling it together is a very important skill. Those are changes. That doesn't mean that they're bad. It just means that change has happened, because change always happens. And if we're going to sit and just resist it and say Google is making us stupid, well, then we're not actually giving ourselves the ability to maximize and take advantage of new opportunities. And then what I meant by what I said, that we also could be proposing incorrect solutions. So maybe you're all familiar. There's been so many news reports about studies about how Facebook makes you depressed. Facebook makes you depressed. But now scientists are starting to go back and look at those studies and are finding that, in fact, those were finding correlation but not causation. In fact, when you dig down into the data, what you're seeing is not that, for example, teenagers are going on Facebook and then becoming depressed, but in fact, that teenagers who are more depressed are going on Facebook. Now, that's a very important distinction, because if your solution, when you hear the first story, is to say, oh, well, then let's take Facebook away from these teenagers, but in fact, Facebook has become part of a solution for depressed teenagers, then you've taken away a valuable tool for them because you thought the problem was wrong. That's what happens when we think that change isn't constant, when we're not willing to sit and understand what change really is, and instead we react very negatively to the thing that we're seeing. So let's talk about some solutions. What have I seen across time in which people have managed to get people to embrace it and to understand change? All right, 3. Number 1, you got to build a bridge from the familiar. So here's a fun thing. We all took a elevator up to this floor, which means that we stepped, I mean, think about it. We stepped into a box with no windows, and it moved us. That was very scary for a long time. It was a terrifying idea. I mean, there's really no other experience that is like that. We otherwise will never step into a completely enclosed space, and it will move us. Cars, airplanes, they all have windows at least. And we know there's somebody driving it. Maybe it's us. But the elevator was different. But for a very long time, what the elevator had was a person who was moving it. In the early days, literally physically moving it by like pulling a rope, which sounds insane, but that's what they were doing. And then eventually, there was a wheel and so on. And then in the 40s and 50s, the technology existed to have these things move up and down by themselves. And people were freaked out. You know what they said? They said, do you know what the elevator thinks? They were genuinely thinking that. What does the elevator think? I'm stepping into this thing. It's moving by itself. What does it think? It's scary. It's scary. You know what the solution was? The solution, among some other things, but this is a really important one, sounds so simple it's going to sound stupid, but it was important. The solution was adding a female voice that says, going up, going down, floor 1, floor 2. It was replacing the human being that was already in there. It was giving us a bridge from the familiar. And this is something that I think that innovators often totally forget about, because they're so convinced, rightfully so, that they've built something that people will want, that contributes value to the world. And so you forget that when you introduce something that's radically new to people, that those people might be like, ah! And so instead, what you need to do is think, well, what can I do that's already familiar to them? How can I find something to show them that, you know what, different isn't that different. Different isn't that different. Another great example of this was the car. When the car was introduced, we all think of that the major moment for the car was Henry Ford and the Model T. And that's true in that was able to bring the car to the masses and mass produce the car. But what happened before Henry Ford was perhaps of equal importance. So when the car first came out, it was scary, and if you drove down the street with a car, people would yell, "Get a horse!" at you. They'd yell, "Get a horse!" at you. And so you know what happened? Eventually, the car makers realized that you needed to build a bridge from the familiar. People liked their horses. And here were these companies coming along and saying, I'm going to replace your horse. People don't want that. People don't want that. So what'd you do? Well, you started building horses into the car. Why do we have the word horsepower? Why are so many cars named after horses? In the early days, sometimes there were some manufacturers that were building like kind of mechanical looking horse heads and putting them on the front of the cars. The idea was to say, no, we are not replacing your horse, we're literally giving you a better horse. It's a bridge from the familiar, and it makes a difference. Here's number 2. Don't let the early adopters define you. Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, has this theory that I really like about how to build a company, and it is this: ignore your early customers for your scale customers. The idea is to think about who your scale customer is and how to communicate with them and how to build something for them. And don't get bogged down in what your early customers may want, because they may not be the same thing. And I think this is true for introductions of new technologies. So for example, so here's the Scorcher nuisance. Scorchers were what early bicycle riders were called. They would get on these bicycles and they would just like blaze down. They would smash into people. They were very obnoxious. But this is a thing, right? This is a thing. When new technology comes out, especially very transformative technology, it is often expensive, and therefore it is most accessible to people with wealth. And because there isn't necessarily the infrastructure for this to make sense in their world, they just kind of treat it like toys, and then they come to define what this technology is for the masses. And that can be a real problem. Early car drivers were just like blazing down country roads, hitting farmers' chickens and dogs, and farmers were going out with guns to shoot at the car drivers. Now, that was because the early adopters of the car were being obnoxious, but that didn't mean that the technology was bad. So what you need to do is think about how you can get this thing to the masses and how you can communicate to the masses that this is valuable to all of you, instead of just focusing on those early adopters. I think this is also, for whatever it's worth, the reason why people are so opposed to the kind of e-scooters that you find out on streets right now, because the early adopters were super obnoxious. They were just like leaving them lying around on the sidewalks. You have to get past them. And then here's number 3. Innovate inside the gaps. So the waltz. We think of it as a nice, classy dance now. When it was introduced, scary and scandalous. Scary and scandalous. So here's police breaking up a marathon dance. This was in 1910, but that's at the time where they were just very much concerned about the amount of physical contact that was happening with the waltz. But go back a century earlier to the early 1800s, and there was another concern. Interesting concern. The concern was medical. The concern was that the waltz would literally take years off of your life. This was in medical literature, that the amount of waltzing that you would do would be directly correlating with the years you would lose off your life. Why? Well, they were particularly concerned about women and all the physical activity of women moving around and spinning, and that's just not something that women should be doing. Their bodies aren't built for it. And yet, here's the thing. They were right and they were wrong. They were right and they were wrong. I was really expecting them to just be totally wrong about this, because most times when you go through history, you see all these crazy medical concerns like bicycle face, and you're like, that's just silly and ridiculous. But in this case, the waltz actually was kind of dangerous for people. It actually was unhealthy. The reason, however, wasn't because of the waltz. It wasn't because of women's bodies. It was because they were waltzing in buildings that did not have modern ventilation, that were using gas lighting. They were dancing on these things called crash pads or crash something or other, which are basically these rugs that had collected all sorts of dust, and now they're dancing on it. It's just getting kicked up into the air, and they're breathing it all in, and they're wearing extremely tight clothing. So yeah, the waltz was unhealthy, but it wasn't the problem with the waltz. It was the problem with literally everything around the waltz. So you have to identify, where's the gap? Where's the gap here between the user and the innovation? And I would say that the scooters are another great example of this. So people are going out on these scooters right now, and they are, in some cases, they're getting hit by cars. There are accidents. Some people are dying. It sounds scary, and those are tragedies. But scooter companies are now looking inside the data about who is having accidents, and what they're finding is that the most accidents, the majority of accidents, take place on someone's very first ride. The problem isn't technology. The problem is that people don't know how to use it, and that they're not comfortable with it on the first ride. And if anybody's hopped on one of these scooters, you know that the first ride is pretty wobbly. Pretty wobbly. And so now they're starting to run, I know Lime in particular is doing this, they're starting to run these sessions where they'll bring people and introduce them to the technology and get them comfortable with it. That's innovating inside the gap. The problem isn't the technology. The problem was something between the technology and the use. That is what will get people away from the scary part of it and towards embracing and understanding how it fits into their world. So those are some things. Obviously, history is complicated, and there's a lot to see and digest. But I hope that this at least gets you thinking that because people react to something negatively does not mean perhaps that they are foolish. It means that they are reacting naturally the way that we all just think. And what we often need is storytelling and good understanding about the people who are receiving these innovations, receiving these new technologies, and the things that they may be missing in their understanding of how it fits into their world. And then it is our job as innovators, as people who are involved in creating the world in which innovation takes place, to pave that path and get them towards this very unnatural, but at the same time, important thing, which is change. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jason. Anytime my team, I tend to be a morning person, so anytime my team thinks I'm too chipper in the morning, I'm going to play his video right there, and they're going to think I'm super mellow and chill. So again, I'm Brian Wazlowski from the Center for Democracy and Technology. I actually have in my notes something saying now we're going to change the pace a bit. We're not. We're going to keep it going with some kind of fiery, interesting talks here. This is one of my very favorite parts of the program each year, where we actually ask people to come up here and do lightning talks to the prompt of, can we overcome present-day challenges to grow an internet where speech and democracy thrive? And obviously that is a very difficult and broad question, and you're going to get some very broad answers to that, and I'm excited about it. As I said, this is a lightning talk round, so speakers are going to come up, they're going to present, and then they're going to go off stage. You're going to have questions. I'm going to ask you to save those questions till the very end of the day. We are actually going to bring all 6 of our lightning talk speakers back to the stage and let you ask questions of them. So during this round, just applause wildly once they're done, but save your questions until the very end. So I am going to kick this off right now with our very first lightning talk speaker. His name is Abdul Hamid Bilici. He's a journalist who is in exile, who was the editor of the largest newspaper in Turkey until it was shut down by the current regime.
I guess this mic is it okay? That's great. So it is very difficult sometimes to speak after the lunch. I understand, but luckily I had a dynamic speaker before me, so you're not sleeping. So as it is introduced, I am the editor-in-chief of the largest Turkish newspaper, namely Zaman. In English means time. And I will tell you why I am not with my newspaper, but here for 3 years. And I mean, to share my experience, you know, we are talking all this rise of authoritarianism, populism, all those things. I see many Americans are talking those things as if they are faraway things. Happening in Russia, in Hungary, or in Turkey. This was my feeling 5 years ago. When it was taking place in Russia, you know, Russia had a short democratic period under Yeltsin. So it switched to authoritarianism by crashing the critical media, all those things. So while these things were happening, I was thinking that this is something not much related to me, to us. But it did not go that way. And I am here as an exiled editor of the largest Turkish newspaper. And I feel myself lucky because a lot of my friends are in jail in more terrible situations. So I will try to underline 4 points that may be interesting for you, maybe food for thought or your questions. So the fake news, you know, is very popular in last couple of years in this country, but fake news is not a new thing. So my newspaper, which was established in mid-80s, was established to fight against the fake news, which means fake news was existing. So it was not by the social media, by the conventional media, by the newspapers and by the TV stations. And our first book of our publishing company was the collection of fake news and their true versions. So some of those things are spoken as if they are very new things, but they are not. And the newspaper that I was editing was supporting an inclusive democracy. We were inviting different voices from the society, the Armenians, the Kurds, Turks, conservatives, liberals, seculars, whatever. And we were trying to fight fake news. And we were supporting Turkey joining European Union and to be a better democracy, a full-fledged democracy if possible. And we supported this current ruling party, the Erdogan, who was in town yesterday, maybe one day before. And because he was acting in that direction. But when we saw after 2012, 2013, that the direction of Turkey or Erdogan is not the European Union membership, but a kind of one-man rule, an authoritarian regime. And when we learned the huge amount of corruption, as responsible media, we started to be critical. And when we started to be critical, we were threatened by a lot of means, from tax inspection to court cases, canceling our press cards, and a lot of things. But we struggled from 2013 until 2016, March, and in March, until that time, we did not change our editorial line, but then Erdogan used the nuclear option to shut down our newspaper. And I will show you a short video, if you can see, because it's very difficult for me to describe how they came to occupy our newspaper and kicked me out of the building, literally. So if you play the video, voice. Yeah, this happened not far away place in Turkey, a NATO ally, not in far distance history. It was in just March 2016, 2016. So, and this is not just one media that was targeted. 200 media outlets similar to my newspaper were silenced, 200. And 240,000 websites were blocked, including Wikipedia. Currently, it is also blocked. And 95% of media is currently under one person's order. Whatever he says, they upload, and there is the 5%, 10% remaining media, and it is struggling to survive. So this is, you can just imagine what would happen if there is similar thing to Washington Post or New York Times. This was a very similar, identical thing that happened in my country back 3 years ago. I don't have much time, but I will speed up what I will say about the general issues that we underlined and spoke here. Just the problem is the problem the medium or the people that are creating those mediums or using those mediums? That is very important in my view. In this, when these things were happening in Turkey, there are more than 10,000 journalists. Not all of them objected to what's happening. Maybe a tiny 5% or 10%. And they are facing exile or prison terms. A lot of them are in conformity. They continue their life as if nothing happened. Here, there has been a delegation of our president accompanying journalists, even did not bother to ask about the fate of journalists in Turkey, which is 150 behind bars currently, now as I'm talking here. So the issue is we are all tested. And the medium is important, Facebook or online or the conventional media. I was tested as a reporter, as a journalist, as editor. But this is not limited to me. The Twitter company is also tested. You know, now, since I am devoid of all my normal media, I use the social media. This is a good option that we are all cherishing. But is it functioning as we are expecting it to function? No. I have more than 200,000 followers on Twitter. If you check from my name, you can find it. It's a verified account, but it is blocked in Turkey. Why it is blocked? Because Twitter acts in cooperation with the government of Erdogan. And there has been lots of reports and warnings about that. Twitter did not change its policy. I am struggling against the authoritarian ruler in Turkey, but also struggling with those platforms that are cherished to be the voice of the voiceless, or and the test is not limited to Twitter. The NBA, you know, recently one person from NBA said this is not good to be critical, to support the protesters in Hong Kong, and they had to apologize, unfortunately. So every one of us tested, and of course, the media literacy is very important, but we need to learn about how to keep our integrity as developers, or as journalists, or as human beings, as people. And the last two remarks that I will say, to protect freedoms that we enjoy now. Media freedom cannot be protected just by journalists. There should be an awareness by the academy, by the business, by the political parties, and everyone. Otherwise, it is not, you cannot protect it. That we were not able to protect it, as you saw in the video. And the final point is, without a independent judiciary, it is not possible to protect those rights that we are enjoying today. Because those people who came to our newspaper, to occupy my newspaper, they came with a court decision, which was a kangaroo court. So with that remark, I will finish and expect your questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Abdul Hamid, and that's especially poignant remarks for a place like this where you have the front covers of so many newspapers out front and just imagining those being shut down by the government. So thank you. Our next speaker is Amber Balde of Clovyr, a company that focuses on the practical application of blockchain technology. Blockchain, we brought it in. So Amber, please, welcome.
Hello? Which thing should I be using here? Hello? Oh, there we go. Success. It has connected. Hi, yeah, so my name's Amber Balde, and I do run a company that works on helping people make and run applications that function differently. And what that means is these are applications that have some functionality that is decentralized, censorship resistant, or privacy preserving. Sometimes, yes, that involves a blockchain, not all the time. We can get to that later. I'm also on the board of the Zcash Foundation. Zcash is a cryptocurrency that attempts to be essentially digital cash. And there are a lot of cryptocurrencies or other payment systems you use that claim that they're digital cash. But really what they're working on is making sure that you have money that you can put in your pocket digitally or under your mattress digitally, and you can spend it without having to ask someone else permission. And so while I have a lot of thoughts about online communication in general, I'm going to attempt to limit the content today to things that specifically talk about this kind of intersection of blockchains and decentralized systems and why people are raising these technologies when they're talking about freedom of speech. And fundamentally, I think it's because they've heard in some of these white papers from some of these consultancies that blockchains are an immutable ledger of something. And because they're replicated across many nodes on a network, they become censorship resistant. Whatever you put on them is censorship resistant. And while this is true, it's not necessarily a silver bullet for supporting freedom of speech. That said, what you do get is a censorship-resistant system. And so we end up in a place where we have an internet where you would like to sometimes have things that stick around for a long time, like for the example that we had, Wikipedia. We would always like people to have access to Wikipedia. The Internet Archive actually does a fantastic job of replicating and mirroring that. You don't need a blockchain for it, but you'd like that to stick around. There are other things we'd like to stick around, like, say, the records of the Environmental Protection Agency. But then there are actually some things that we really wish would disappear from the internet. So things like revenge porn, or, say, all of the collective works of Iggy Azalea, the musician. And the problem is that we fundamentally don't agree on which stuff belongs in which category. And technically, it's impossible to create a system that satisfies both of those things simultaneously. You cannot have a system where everything can stick around forever, but we also can unilaterally remove some things when it serves our purposes. And so these types of systems are not just a silver bullet for solving freedom of speech. But where might an immutable log be helpful? Well, perhaps we're supposed to postulate on what this future might look like. Perhaps in the future, we could actually be digitally signing events that we consensually would like to place into the public domain in an ongoing basis. So, for example, I could co-sign with my university that I received a diploma, and that could not be taken away from me, no matter where in the world I moved. We can prevent diploma fraud. Yay, that's great. Maybe also we could say have the event producers here, along with me and perhaps whoever in the room would like to participate, sign that the video record of this is the canonical event of what happened here today. And then no matter where it was replicated, we would be able to ensure that that was the right video. Why does that matter? Well, when one of my loving, adoring fans from 4chan decides to create a deep fakes version of me saying absolutely awful things up here, it would be wonderful to be able to repudiate that kind of sentiment. So is an insurance policy on reality really something that should be part of a discussion on freedom of speech? I'm not sure, but when we can make anybody appear to say anything, does freedom of speech kind of even matter anymore? And that sounds really nihilist, and it's a dystopia that's kind of fun to think about as a thought experiment, because we're not quite there yet, but we will be. But we have our own different kind of fun dystopias that we actually live in today, right? The surveillance, capitalism, centralized infrastructure dystopia that we live in here. So Let's talk about decentralization. So if you're not familiar with what people mean when they're talking about decentralized infrastructure these days, they mostly mean limiting specific bottlenecks and points of failure on various networks, right? And so what that's supposed to mean is that people have more choice. People have more agency. It's a distribution of power, not just a distribution of network topology. But that results in, hopefully, more freedom of the participants in the network. But the thing is, we used to actually have this kind of decentralization. We're re-decentralizing the web these days. Remember when you used to take a floppy disk and you would stick it into your computer and install an application, and then you would like tippy type in your document, and then you would accidentally lose your college thesis and there was no way to recover it? You had your data. You take back your data. But that was actually bad for a number of reasons, not least of which the resilience of losing your documents, but also it was very hard to collaborate. It was hard to share, and it was also very inefficient. It's not a great storage model as we started to build these clouds, so we moved everything. But in doing so, we also abdicated control of the underlying data of these applications because we didn't want to deal with the management of their infrastructure. And those things were tightly coupled. So hopefully some of the work that I'm doing and that other people in the space are doing is working on decoupling that again so that we can get normal people to be able to run their own kind of infrastructure without having to become technical geniuses. What does that look like? Does it mean that we all start running servers in our basement again? Hopefully not. Probably not. Generally bad for security. Do it. Hopefully not. You can if you want, but most people won't. And that's the thing, and that's where a lot of like cypherpunk ideology has failed over the last 20 years, is we cannot actually convince normal people to do that. So if you want to, have at it. But what we can do is segment existing public clouds and let people run their own kind of tiny little virtual private clouds where you have you have control over your own domain. And then you can connect from what you're running there to what's running in other people's little clouds. And you can start to create these sorts of decentralized sorts of social networks, which are awful from a content moderation standpoint, by the way. Censorship-resistant communication for sure. Absolutely, absolutely awful administration controls for content moderation. But what you can do is you can also go back to your document, right? You can create your own document just like you were using Microsoft Word locally on your laptop. And you feel like you do that with Google Docs today. I mean, it says private with you. You haven't shared it with anybody, right? But there are a number of instances of journalists working on private drafts and having them simply removed from their G drive while they're in progress of writing them. So what do we have to do so that we get the benefits of this kind of collaborative, efficient sharing without having to go become these like digital hermits in a cave in order to also have our own private thoughts? We should be able to bring these two things together. And then we need to bring into that the financial applications. So the ability to create marketplaces and have e-commerce and everything. And what that means is that we need to have a point of sale system that replicates the experience we've had for 30, 50 years, where you can walk in and someone says cash or credit. Right now, we're moving as a society towards cashless payments. That means that every payment is a request to someone else to approve your ability to make that payment. You might feel like because it's coming from your bank account over a debit transaction that was cash you had, but it's not actually. It's still a request to someone else. So having a digital equivalent of cash, and when you say cash or credit, yeah, it's a euphemism for something like a publicly accessible cryptocurrency, and different ones of them have different privacy properties, sure. But what we need is to maintain the individual dignity of the ability to make private payments. What does that mean? Well, our First Amendment does guarantee us the right to freedom of association, the ability to not have chilling effects when we donate to a nonprofit that perhaps we wouldn't want our name associated with in the public record. Or going forward, I'd maybe like to buy a candy bar without my health insurer hearing about it. When we have a completely cashless system that's simply based on our existing credit payment rails, you cannot prevent your insurer from hearing about every purchase that you make. And so we end up in this final situation where we need to focus on taking back the rights, the agency that we have over our communication systems. And when we are given a choice in this tug of war between privacy and between security and enforcement, we should always kind of tug towards this privacy side because we can get creative with enforcement. We can get creative with moderation. But when we give up our unassailable kind of cryptographic privacy, there is simply no way to claw that back. And then what we end up with is a surveillance state powered by surveillance capitalism, and where we have given up that freedom in the name of this kind of ephemeral security. Thank you.
Thank you, Amber, and thank you for teeing up nonprofits. We at CDT do take both cash and credit. That was fantastic. We have one final speaker in our lightning round. Her name is Hoda Hawa, and she is from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. Please welcome Hoda.
Good afternoon, everyone. Is this on? Good. I just first want to start with thanking CDT for having me here today. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about, I think, this really important issue, and I think emerging issue, particularly for vulnerable and marginalized communities online in the digital space. So whether we are describing the hashtag campaigns that grew the movement for Black lives, that added momentum to dreamers, or that spurred on the Arab Spring, or take, for example, the use of smartphone cameras and live streaming to document the realities of oppressive experiences for communities of color, or the narrative-changing storytelling of YouTube creators from all backgrounds, internet platforms have birthed, expanded, and made social change not only possible, but global in their implications. At the Muslim Public Affairs Council, we work on public perceptions and policies that impact and relate to American Muslim communities. Our work now is increasingly focusing on the digital space as we deal with the next frontier of issues that are impacting our communities online. Online safety and digital environments have numerous challenges and nuances, and we work regularly with our constituencies and other underserved communities to ensure we're in the process of finding a balance between safety and expression. The internet has opened up unprecedented opportunities for diverse communities to speak, create, educate, and even entertain by building a direct connection with their audience. When mainstream media outlets fail to serve diverse communities with relatable content or resolve lingering issues of underrepresentation or misrepresentation, marginalized communities have sought out digital platforms and online services to tell their stories. In some cases, this has led to larger networks recognizing and providing space for previously overlooked talent. Take, for example, Issa Rae or Hassan Minhaj, who organically grew their audiences and their online communities on YouTube and created such a critical mass of followers that they were able to show major networks that their content is sellable in major mainstream markets. In other cases, it has given a platform to voices that would otherwise be silenced, as we heard previously. It's important to note that the same freedom that has allowed us to share our too often unheard and unseen content has also provided a space for voices that promote hate and marginalization, which impact the ability of our communities to flourish. At Unpack, we believe that outlining the boundaries of the digital public sphere is a matter of serious deliberation. We must address the ways in which hate speech, misinformation, and disinformation have multiplied, oftentimes to the detriment of vulnerable communities. The hate that we see online is only a reflection of the hate that our communities face globally. So depleting oxygen from these toxic digital spaces can diminish the audience that these extremists so clearly seek out. And at the same time, we must aggressively protect against any censorship, be it promoted by government or by the private sector, that would limit or inhibit the ability of our communities and communities of color to speak, create, and to be fairly compensated for their work. From creating and building authentic narratives online to ensuring that communities remain engaged in the political and civic process, the internet can also create an environment of hyperpartisanship and information overload. Activities online from groups seeking to marginalize communities make it harder to vote, leading to a continuum of reasons for why our communities are underrepresented at the polls and in politics. At best, technology can spur civic engagement by exposing information that traditional platforms cannot or will not. And at worst, technology can promote conspiracy theories and inaccurate information, or even make our election systems vulnerable. Pew Research Center, in partnership with Elon University's Imagining the Internet Center, conducted a large-scale canvassing of tech experts, government officials, corporate leaders, and scholars, and they asked this question: in the next decade, will public discourse online become more or less shaped by bad actors, harassment, trolls, and an overall tone of griping, distrust, and disgust? Nearly 40% of the respondents expected that the future of the online public sphere will be shaped by more negative activities. That's a very, I think, disturbing trend, I think, that we're going in. So I believe that in order to counter that future filled with more negative activities, we need to form a cultural strategy based on the idea that narrative builds power for people. And we can leverage that power over those who set the incentives, the rules, and the norms that shape society online. We can collectively overcome the trolls and those bad actors through the power of narratives. I'm not saying that we are seeking to completely eradicate hate and divisiveness. That's, I don't think, a complete possibility. But I am pushing for us to think creatively, using those diverse voices online to build a digital society that does not incentivize hate. We can't talk about shaping the future of speech online for a diversity of speakers without ensuring the inclusion of all of those communities in these conversations. So to understand the challenges and the opportunities for diverse voices, we must include those voices in real life as we're creating those policies. And at the same time, building digital equity will not be a top-down approach. It has to be a whole of society approach. And that approach must include tech companies being transparent on things like how often and why they choose to enforce the policies that they do. Ultimately, I am an optimist at heart, so I think we have a chance to do digitally what we have failed to do in real life. We can shape equity in the digital space. MPAC, and I know that there are other organizations, we all stand ready to make a difference. And if online platforms believe in encouraging safe environments, a collaboration between diverse private, public, and advocacy entities must ensue. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Director of the Free Expression Project for the Center of Democracy and Technology, M. Alonzo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today, our Future of Speech Online event. I'd like to do a quick poll to see if my panelists for the upcoming panel are in the room or if everyone is still getting mic'd up. Any panelists? Okay, I think what we're actually going to do right now is take a quick 5 to make sure that you and everybody following on the live stream can hear the panelists when we get started. So please don't stray far. We will be trying to get right back on schedule pretty soon, but we do need to have our amazing speakers here for you to listen to. So stay tuned, 5 minutes or less for the Technology of Engagement panel starting momentarily. Thank you.